Tejasvi, are we live? Yeah, yeah, sure. Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome back to another session at the Founders Friday today. And today we have Abilash with us, who is a seasoned documenter, and through his works, he has actually impacted a lot of individuals and organizations in driving in better communication. So, Abhilash, we would love to hear a little bit of introduction from yourself and how your journey has been till now.
Sure. Firstly, thank you for inviting me here and giving me this chance to be on your videos and meetings. I find it as an humbling and honorable experience. And yeah, about me, like you said, recently I've been a documentarian for almost the last 4 years. But before that, I was into lighting in the sense that I was helping sell lighting and lighting controls for businesses largely. And that's what I had been doing for almost a decade, since from 2011 all the way till the pandemic happened, which meant that I was pretty much on a daily basis talking to people, explaining stuff, selling them stories. You can't just sell a light. I mean, a light is ultimately just a bulb, so you'll have to sell them the benefits of a good lighting design or something like that. So yeah, during that period of a decade, I had to learn the hard way the importance of having a story, even if it's most unlikely, even if it's something that is almost irrational, but you still have to have a story in even to make it an engaging conversation with the stakeholders. So that's what I was learning all through the 10 years in lighting. And then suddenly when the pandemic happened, we had to shift gears, and I didn't want to be out of the doors, so as anybody would. So that's when I wanted to see what other career opportunities are available for me. That's when I thought uh, documenting stuff, becoming a technical writer would be a comparatively easier overlap or crossover from what I was doing into something else. And yeah, since 2020, I've been helping create stories, but to a larger audience comparatively and in a different format. Previously, I was all in person talking to a set number of people, maybe 10, 20 at best, but now it was not live, it was not immediately interactive, but it was still the same story. I mean, it was still the whole point of taking something that is there and making it interesting, while also telling how it solves your problem and why it's the best solution to solve this problem, and so on and so forth. That's about the work side of things. On the life side of things, I've been at it for about 10 years now, and I have a beautiful four-year-old daughter. And I have always been curious about learning more stuff, trying to do things on my own, which is how I got into some conversations with you. And yeah, that's a very brief and convoluted and disorganized introduction about me.
That sounds great, actually. We have like so many things to learn from you and get inspiration. And I'm curious, like, how is documentation different from the usual content or the copies that we see, right? So, how is it different in the sense that through in the way of communication or the messaging or the audience, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so that was one of the first stumbling blocks for me as a documentarian. Like I said previously, in sales and marketing, it was largely about entirely sending a message through stories as such. In the sense, when I say stories, it's a loose term. Not obviously, it's not fables or something that I'm saying, but the whole idea there was to communicate as to the exact problem that it is being solved, what the product is doing, or what writing design is doing for you. But in technical documentation, it is more about how it's going to do that for you. Uh,
Mhm.
for example, if I had to document a lighting solution right now, it would be largely about how many light fixtures would you need, how it would have to be installed, at what distances from each other, what is the power that is to be provided for it, how it has to be maintained, and so on and so forth. Whereas if it was if it was content that is used for marketing predominantly, it would largely be about you have these many lights right now. but you will be replacing them with these many lights, which is a reduction in the total number of things. So that's therefore you save on energy, therefore you save on maintenance costs, therefore you get benefits of your uh, finances in this way, and you also save on carbon emissions and so on and so forth. So that goes in its own track, wherein you say what problems are being solved, whereas in technical documentation it is reaching the same destination in a parallel track, where it's exactly telling you what are the steps that you have to take, what are the stations you've got to cross
Mhm.
before you reach your final destination. That is the simplest and I would say probably the most important distinction. But yeah, I mean these days there are ways of mixing the two as well. There are people who have successfully written documentation which combines the marketing angle to it and bring stories there also. So that's also that um, thinning of the lines is also happening.
Makes sense. So, what motivates you, to wake up every day and, go to work and hit those goals, milestones? Yeah,
I mean, I would usually say if it was an interview that it's the salary, but yeah, it's that's a very bad joke which has not gone down very well over the years. But yeah, in terms of what motivates me, what gets me out of bed, it's largely about it's the realization that there are so many things out there that I still have no idea about. That there are so many things to explore, to figure out, to see how they work with one another, and uh, and to see where different paths will lead. For example, again, like I said, all through the past decade, I was in lighting, which meant that every day the customers would change. I mean, the solution that I was offering would remain the same, but I would talk to a different set of people. Uh, One set of customers would be interested in not the aesthetics of it, but only on the finance side of it. How much money and energy will it save us, and so on and so forth. So the other one would probably be looking at, say, for example, if it's a very high profile client like Google, where the brand value is super critical for them, then it would largely be about how does this light fit in with my aesthetics? How will it actually improve my overall image? And so yeah, the whole learning for me there, or the thing that I would unpack in that time was that every day I have to figure out what the client wants, what the person on the other side of the table wants, and then tell them exactly what I am providing within the solution basket that I have. So that was a great enriching experience at that time in that life. But now as a documentarian, it's largely that I have a very wide field, especially in my current job. It's one of the, what do you say, the biggest semiconductor companies in the world, which means there are so many products that it's not possible to know most of them in one lifetime. So right now the motivation as a documentarian is that every day I get to see new things. I mean, when I started as a technical documentarian, I had no idea about software. I'm not a software guy, but I had to learn about Kubernetes, and I had to learn about Dockers and containers and how to spin them up,
Mhm.
and AWS and cloud and all of that. Uh, and quickly, I mean, it was not like I had time about 6 months or something. It was largely possibly a couple of weeks for me to get up to speed with that. And that happened. Then there was the other technology. It was largely about what we call as radio networks, right? The 4Gs, 5Gs, and all. That was my second, or the company I was working for at that time. They were dealing in those products. So we do know the terms 2G, 3G, 4G, but what do they actually do? How do
Hmm.
the towers interact? How does your phone interact with the tower, and what makes it a strong connection or possibly a weak connection, and so on and so forth? So again, that was a totally different in-depth research that I had to do quite quickly, because unless you don't know stuff well enough, you can't really write it, right? So
Exactly.
that was a second gig. And again, so without getting into the details, the larger point here is that I find it interesting that I'm being paid to learn so many things every day. Uh, and it's uh, no job is perfect, obviously. Every job has its own pros and cons, but at least in all the jobs that I have held, the pros have always outweighed the cons. So yeah, that's the motivation, getting to learn new things every single day.
Sounds great. Yeah. I think that's the goal of every individual. The pros always, overtake the cons.
Yeah. in general
Uh,
in life, I would say.
yeah, yeah, true. So, according to you, like how do documentation, affect businesses, and how does it impact businesses as a whole, right? From your experience and from your contributions to the work you have done. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's multiple angles to it. Again, this I would say that I also learned quite recently. When I'm fairly new to the whole side of documentation, but there are in some businesses, especially documentation is a it's almost like a legal mandate. You've got to have it, otherwise you just can't sell your product. In the sense
Mhm.
that, let's say, one of the projects, again going back to my lighting days, one of my projects was at an airport, and obviously that is super critical when it comes to security and also
Yeah.
ensuring that systems do not fail. That's the most important thing for them.
Yeah.
No matter what system it is, if it's the communication system where the command center talks to the flights actually, or staff talk to each other, or the security forces talk to uh, within themselves and with other agencies and so on and so forth. So effectively, every single system in an airport, it has to be airtight. It cannot fail at all. So what that means is that when it comes to the minute details, when you're putting up a system in an airport, you've got to have everything documented perfectly, but it also cannot be elaborate. It cannot be a page's worth of manual wherein you're explaining every single tiny thing. Because, as an example, what happens in a flight during an abnormal situation also carries over to an airport. For example, if you watch this movie, I forget the name, Tom Hanks, starring Tom Hanks, about the airliner that is landing on the Hudson River. I think Sully is the name of the movie. But there, the moment they detect that the engines have blown off, they have a checklist. They need to go through that and figure out what has to be done next, right? So similarly, for the airport staff, also for the system that they are operating with, there has to be a detailed manual saying that if this happens, then this has to be done, or these are the things that you've got to run by and see if it is working or not working, or what might have caused the failure, or what something like that. So, and that is a legal requirement as well. It's also mandated by the airport, but also by the body that oversees the operations of the airport all across the country. So in that sort of a situation, documentation becomes mandatory. So if, as a business, if you've got to, or even as to pitch your solutions or your products, it becomes mandatory that you've got to have very clean, very crisp, and yet very helpful and actionable documentation to even enter the negotiation ring. And whereas in some other cases, for example, uh, in the case of my first job as a documentarian, that was a comparatively new product at that time. The long and short of it is that Kubernetes, as it is a great technology, but at that point, having to set it up meant that you had to be really, really good at it. You would have to be a proper expert level programmer, and figure out how to configure every single component of it, for lack of a better word. So therefore, the documentation that we were creating back then, it also, like I said, proxied as a marketing tool, in the sense that you didn't really have to have access to the tool or the dashboard or the platform before you could access the documentation. You could just go through the documentation. You would read the individual steps, the user guides, the feature that were available, the integrations in detail, and you would basically get an idea of what it can do for your business, how it's going to be set up, and what you would need to have in your business or in your infrastructure before this can be integrated with your system, and so on and so forth. That's not unique to them. That happens pretty much with every software, I would say. I mean, even OpenAI, I think, for example, has their own document. Uh, I don't know right now if they're classified as open source or not. But the larger point, again, stepping back, is that in some cases, in those sort of a case, your documentation becomes a proxy tool for you to tell your user, to your audience, as to how exactly this will benefit. Right? I mean, again, like I said, I know when I want to go to the documentation, by that point, I'm convinced that will or this may solve the problem that I have. But when I'm reading the documentation, I know exactly how it's going to solve my problem. So that's the second side of things. So even as an individual or as a business, how documentation, or at least people that I know about, how they are looking at is, uh, it's a different level of, or you can say phase two of marketing for them. Phase one of marketing, or the top of funnel, as I call it, I think, is that with the stories that they're creating, with the bombardment of information on the social media or whatever is as applicable, they get leads, they get people, they get eyeballs. Basically, they want people to look at your business or your solution. And then the next level is that with documentation like this, they retain you there. They want to hold you there and convince you and answer all your questions as a user that you may have even before you ask them, so that you come there and you're convinced that okay, this at least I've got to try. So that's how they're looking at it as a marketing tool. And on the final side, that was what documentation used to be long back. And even I would say 5 6 years ago also, you would have to have thick bundles of booklets. Anything you buy, a new TV, a new car, a new phone, anything, you would get a booklet, and that would exactly tell you all the, I mean, if there was a legal requirement, it would be mentioned there. And even otherwise, it would exactly tell you how you set it up, how you get it to function the way it is supposed to function. And these days that is not super common, because people are, I mean, you don't really have, uh, or at least on a daily basis, we don't really interact with extremely complex gadgets, at least in our personal lives. Maybe in our professional lives we do, but uh, but yeah. So that's the initial form of documentation, the classical documentation, again, for the lack of a better word, and that still persists. And I do not see that going away anytime soon. But yeah, the form and format is changing, of course. If it's a Yeah, the form and format is changing, because even if it's a car, for example, they don't really give you a thick booklet now. They just, it's a few pages. You just have a QR code, you scan there, and then it probably gives you a video or a PDF or an interactive chatbot or something like that. So that's happening with some huge companies. That also will happen with, if you know what fix are, they're called digital adoption platforms. So if you have anything that you need to learn about, just go there, and when you open or log into your website, they have interactive buttons saying that click here and this will do that, and so on and so forth. So yeah, effectively those are the three different ways how you can approach documentation for your product and solutions, whether you're an individual or a business, and maybe that will also help increase your target audience.
That was a lot, but yeah, a lot of insights. I Do you think that documenters and documentation is kind of underrated if you see the business as a whole, and from what users see it, right? So, what are your thoughts on that?
That has always been the case. I mean, I know this now, one, as an insider, and two, also because I used to be on the other side also. I used to think that documentation cannot be. I mean, sales is that was the mantra back then. When you sell something, that's when you get the money, and that's about it. That's all the business needs, is what I was thinking, and therefore documentation was almost like an afterthought in a lot of places. Even today, I know a lot of my colleagues, my friends who are working in companies wherein documentation is like, uh, they just they just see technical writers as a living and breathing printer machine or a fax machine, basically. So they just say that this is the raw data. Just clean it up. Let us know. Just put it in the brand guidelines, the style guidelines, and then give it out. Make it quick. Give it us by the end of the day or something like that. So it has been like that. It's not been taken very seriously, but once a company understands how much helpful it is, uh, they they integrate documentation also in their pipeline, right? In their entire system of how they do things. The best example I have is that in a company that I was working for some time, it was a comparatively complex product. It was not available for the general public. It was available for a particular type of customer, which would be largely government agency based. So there, obviously, they could not, the salespeople could not answer the questions because it would be a technical thing, right? So there was a very heavy and very huge customer support team, and it was almost, in terms of numbers, it was almost as big as the sales team itself. And the whole job of that team was to answer the questions, something as simple as where is the power button? How do I change the batteries on this device? How do I connect the antenna when I'm using it in the car, and how do I disconnect it? I mean, the simplest of questions, which if you put it on a single page document, it would still solve the problem. But they were not doing that for a long period of time for I don't know what reasons really. But once they began to understand that a detailed documentation which was being sent along with that product actually reduced the number of calls that the customer support team was getting by close to 60% uh, in just 3 months, in just one quarter. They immediately started focusing more on documentation and then bringing it much before in the engineering process. They started pretty much like as soon as the hardware teams would start designing on the PCB board itself, they would involve the documentation team. The documentation team would not probably have a lot of work to do at that point. They would just observe, and if they needed to make any notes, they would do that. But the value that they realized was that as things are being developed, if the documentation also happens accordingly, it helps the engineering teams also realize where they are probably going wrong, where they may have a different point of view compared to a user, because we are trained as documentarians, we are trained to look at anything from the point of view of a user. We question things assuming that we do not know anything about it. For example, if it's Google Meet, right? My question would be, how do I log in? What do I do? Where do I get in? What happens if the camera is not working? So I know all of this. I mean, if you Google Meet is any which way super intuitive, and even if you attend one meet, you know how it works and what you have to do and so on and so forth. But despite that, we are trained to think on those lines so that we get those questions even before the user spots them when they're actually using the problem. So given that, when we work hand in hand with the design team, with the engineers and all of that, it makes the documentation strong and also the product development process also equally strong. So therefore, businesses are used. It's still the case that a good chunk of companies see documentarians as an afterthought, but it's slowly changing. And luckily for me, at least, I've been in places where they've been quite well valued, well received.
That's pretty amazing. So how I am curious, like how the part of documentation and the entire process is different in digital first companies, right? Like the ones that you were mentioning were mostly physical products and
Yeah.
sort of in those industries, right? So coming to the digital products and maybe SaaS teams and all, how is this entire process different?
Yeah. So the first one, like I said, is what is called as a digital adoption platform. For example, the chatbot and help thing, wherein you just log in. You don't really want to look at the documentation. Just log in, you pay for the service or whatever it is, and then you start using it right away. At that point, we help create those bots also. The text that goes in there, the kind of journey it should go, right, from where to where, and all of that. So that is one super massive leap that we've taken from actually writing it down, in terms of adding screenshots and then saying that this is a figure for login, this is how you log in, and so on and so forth. From there, we've made a massive leap. We pretty much have thrown away 99% of the words. We just say, or we assume that a general user would know quite a few things here. So we made that leap as a mental shift. We've also made that leap in terms of reducing the number of words that a user has to read on the screen. That's one major thing. The other thing is there are a lot of video based, that is non-textual documentation that's happening. Screenshots, actual videos of products being installed on the table. Say for example, as a mock-up. Again, in the case of lighting, we would just take a light and put it in a mock room and show how it has to be installed, how it has to be leveled off, how you set the brightness, and so on and so forth. We make videos of that and we put the videos on YouTube or something and send the link, the QR code or something like that. So that's the other form of how we've had to adapt for digital first companies. And these days, it's also even more. I mean, with the advent of AI, it's more like you don't have to do much, or at least that's the imagination people are having. You just give it to an AI, and the AI runs it, and then it tells you what has to be done and what doesn't have to be done. But there are a few bumps along that road, because as in AI is largely trained to do something that it knows how to do. Whereas with software or with new products, especially, the AI doesn't have a base on which to operate from. That is where humans are still, at least documentarians are still available. We still have some value as of now, at least. I don't know how the things will unfold in the years to come. But right now, it needs a bit of an expertise. It needs a bit of lateral thinking, again, for lack of a better word, to see that what may have been and what is actually happening, and then document the differences of those, and then provide feedback to the team that is building, and also ensure that the documentation is in whatever form it is, videos or PDFs or even XML these days. For some legal requirements, some software has to have the documentation section with where we are leaving what they call as breadcrumbs. You just can't jump directly into the section. Again, taking the example of Google Meet, if my camera is not working, then I don't have to go to the entire documentation section. I just go to exactly the section where it says camera troubleshooting or something like that. That's not entirely new, but making it available at that point when the camera is not working and only at that point, that is a bit of a slight innovation also. So yeah, I mean, we are evolving, whether we like it or not. As technical writers, we've been forced to rapidly evolve as well.
Sounds great. So could you walk us through a step-by-step format or framework or a journey of creating technical documentation that is effective? And maybe you can share some of your secret sauce tips also on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm struggling for words here because it's different for different products,
Very
obviously, especially if it's hardware. Um, so if I had to take the common parts of it, it's largely about, you don't put pen to the paper first. You take the product, whatever it is, and then you play around with this. If you have the freedom, you try to break it. That's where it goes. I had the freedom with lighting controllers in my past life. We would always have one or two spare controllers and spare lighting, which if it blows, we wouldn't really mind. So that if that happens, that's good, because that's where you know that this is the breaking point. This is where I reach, and that is where I have to. That is the point I have to make a good note of, very clearly saying this is your limit, do not cross this limit, as a warning, as a caution, as a note, or something like that. So so there's that, and then it's the rest of the things. Again, like I said, the first things we are trained to is think of what happens when I see this for the first time. What is the question that I may have? It can be as mundane as how do I cut open this box, as to, or even as to how do I fix this thing, how do I power it on. If it feels extremely intuitive and extremely obvious, we discard it. But otherwise, we try to document as many things as possible. Again, in general, when it comes to writing, the adage goes that write freely and then edit tightly, meaning you put all the words that you want to, even if you feel it's not helpful or if it's not adding any value, you put the words there, and then you can, because you can then chop it off. But if you already have a very small piece of content, then you would go about expanding it and then going back and seeing if it makes sense or not, and so on and so forth. Digressing a bit there, but then coming back to the original question of how do you go about documentation. Again, the simplest way is to not start off with writing. Start off with seeing um, how it may appear to the user. Again, we have, as designers, as sales people, as creators of something, we are very very familiar with the product. So we almost have blinders, in terms of how we see the product versus how the user see it. So if at all possible, give it to somebody uh, who has never seen the product or who has not used the product. Let them see, let them have questions, let them observe how they do things, right? Where they stumble again, and then create your outline. After that, once you have your outline, it's largely not so different from how you create content for marketing, right? You have an outline, you create a structure, you see what words fit in and words do not fit in. The other difference in terms of actual writing or actual words that you put in a technical document is that we try to remove as many words as possible and even as many sections as possible. For example, there used to be a time where in documentation we would say, click on the save button to save this file, or to save the configuration, and so on and so forth. These days, we are eliminating, at least in some companies that I know of, we are eliminating that sort of a thing. What is intuitive? we try to not put it as a step, because again, if you look at the mindset of a user when they come to see a documentation, it's largely when they have a problem, when they're facing a problem, when they're stuck somewhere, right? So they don't really want to read through multiple pages or multiple lines, even in this age of very short attention spans. They just want to get to the point, see how it is solved, and then move on and get back to whatever they were doing. Right? So there we try to shorten as many words, even individual words. If you can remove, we try to do that. And yeah, we use some minor tricks, like just like in content marketing, we have the frameworks, AIDA frameworks, we have the PAS framework, and so on and so forth, multiple frameworks. Similarly, we use something called as purpose location, PLA, purpose location action and result, when it comes to the technical documentation. Again, a random example of that would be to connect to the Wi-Fi. What would you do? That is the piece of documentation you're writing, right? So again, PLR says that purpose. That is, the purpose is to connect to a Wi-Fi, and the location would be in your phone, as an example. Open settings, and then the action is click on Wi-Fi, and then click on Wi-Fi, and maybe the next action is select the Wi-Fi signal that you want, and then add your password, and so on and so forth. So, and then the result will be that now you are connected, the result or the result section is that if you're not connected, then you have to do this. But if you're connected, that's the end of that workflow. So that's one, again, very random thing that just popped into my mind. It's called PLAR. So yeah, there's no such secret sauce that works everywhere. But just like in general writing, there are small nuances here and there that you pick up as and when you write more and more.
Yeah, so all your explanations really resonate that you're a seasoned documenter, and all of them are like really detailed and so insightful. I would really say that. And like till now we've been speaking about from the user perspective, right? Like how documentation actually affects the user and then the business goals, right? So I would like to understand like from a business internal team perspective, right?
Right.
How can this affect the communication, or what are the challenges people usually face, and how does documentation fit in there?
Right. So again, if I was a business owner, or if I was even say in the engineering team, and if I was somehow connected with documentation, what I would look for is that I would see if the documentation team can bring about uh, if the documentation team can find loopholes before the users can. It's like I would think of them as a different form and format of the testing team, for lack of a better word, right? Uh, I would rather have internal people shout at me so that I can fix it then, rather than have a paying customer or somebody from the external world shout at me saying that this is not good, this is horrible. I mean, I paid for this crap, I don't want it. So that's one way of looking at documentation. That's one way of figuring out how they can plug the holes which may not even be visible to me. Like I said, because we see from wherever we stand, we have a different point of view of whatever we are creating. So to avoid that, I would look at the documentation team as an extension of that, of my testing team, or of my, if you want, even the project management team. And also, like we touched upon in the very beginning, I would also see it as a small extension of the marketing team, if it is possible. If it's a really huge company with some decently held timelines, then maybe the marketing team and documentation can somehow somewhere dovetail and see that there is synergy there also. What I mean by that is, there was a case where in the marketing brochures, pamphlets, and all of that, the sales material, they were using some terminology which was never seen in the documentation at all. So when I was being sold the product, I was told a few terms, and based on that, I have some familiarity with the product. But when I have purchased the product, I've installed it in my system, and I'm about to use it, those terms are nowhere to appear. So I am left confused as to, okay, what is this and what is that, and how do they match one to one with one another? So I want to use the product. I don't want to, you know, play a game of mix and match or fill in the blanks at that point. So even in that sort of a situation, if I am a business owner, or if I am even an individual or a freelancer working on those lines, I would look at it from that lens, if at all possible, if I have that luxury of time. And and yeah, one good thing that I would, or again, this is a biased perspective because I am a documentarian. But if at all possible, if the company can provide some leeway for the documentation team, some decent timeline, right? If the product teams are given, say, 12 months to develop the product, then it wouldn't be a huge stretch of imagination to allow the documentation team at least 1 month, right? It's almost 10% of the entire time. Just give them that time so that they come up with some really good documentation. And again, the benefits are, it may not be tangible, but like I said, if that 1 month can save 60% of your customer support calls, then it's definitely worth it. So yeah, I mean, just being aware of these aspects of documentation, which are largely intangible. uh, I don't know. I think that might help business owners and individuals who are working along those lines.
This makes me come up with like another question, like I have doubt about. So, coming to startups, right? Companies who are about to get launched, or the new startups who are coming up, right? From the process of user research to launching the product, where do you think documentation comes into the picture, and how sooner or how later should business and teams should start focusing on that?
Yeah, how sooner is, again, it once these days, I mean, with the agile working and all of that, people just want to get an MVP out there as soon as possible, right? So in that sort of a extremely rush scenario, I would say that involve the documentation team right from the beginning. As soon as you have your user research done, right, your target persona, as soon as it is fixed, it would be helpful. Again, there we would not create the documentation as such, but we would know the kind of person we are writing for. Why is that important? Think of WhatsApp, for example. WhatsApp has to be used, may be used by anybody from the ages of, I don't know, let's say 13, 14, or all the way up to 80 also. So I have to write it in such, my language in that sort of a product has to be good, so good that, or so simple that if my mother reads it, she should understand it. Or if my daughter reads it, again, my daughter is 4, she would not read it. But the point is, my younger sister who reads it, she should be able to understand it clearly. And if I understand, it's not like you have a bunch of words and those words are simple words, and therefore I can understand every single word of it. That's not the point. Again, like I said, as documentarians, we are trained to take them from point A to point B with the least amounts of words possible. So if I know the user persona, then I can already start thinking on those lines. Do I have to be extremely detailed in terms of how do you install WhatsApp? Is that necessary, or do I assume that this user is familiar with WhatsApp and they just need to know about this new feature? So that's one thing. Or else, again, on the other end of the spectrum, if I'm writing about Kubernetes for somebody that I know is a proper expert level programmer, then I don't have to explain to them what an API is or where they have to find it or how they integrate those APIs into their systems. I just need to give them the list of, yeah, what payload they have to, or what they should expect, what they should send, and what they would get back, and so on and so forth. So so yeah, as soon as possible in the entire process would generally be a great idea. But even if not, I would say, even if it's a hardware product, for example, as soon as you're beginning to design the prototype, we should definitely be there. That is the best way out.
Makes sense. So, like when we say documentation, right, a lot of people get a lot of types of documentation in their minds, like UX documentation, technical documentation, product requirement documentation, right? So, can you like briefly tell us that how all of them are like different from each other, and what type of stakeholders get involved in these aspects?
Yeah, these days again, like I said, a few years ago, even not a lot of years ago, even if it was 5, 6, 10 years ago, you would largely have a documentation team. It was a much simpler time. There would be one type of documentation, and that's about it. And the PRD things that you're saying, that would be under the product manager, for example. I think it's even now with the product manager, but documentation can help. I mean, they have helped in some instances. Again, UX would largely come under the UI UX, the design team itself. But these days, what's happening is, like I said, because some companies are understanding the value that we provide, they are involving us, even if we do not hold the entire responsibility of those different types of documents. we are being involved in that. Again, I'm slightly sidestepping your actual question of what are the different types of documents. That's hard to answer because there are so many different types, and people keep inventing new types every single day. Uh, and as an example, not a non-documentation example, we didn't have the job type called as prompt engineer like 18 months ago, but now that's a very highly paid job, right? So similarly, in documentation also uh, there weren't a lot of different types of documentarians. Also these days, UX writer, that's a proper job. There are proper courses. There are people who are specializing only in UX writing. And when I first learned about it, it was very surprising. It was, at least in my mind, it was comical. I was thinking, why would somebody think about writing only specific lines? How does it even make sense? But the training that I was attending, the trainer over there, she was a proper UX writer, had been for a few years, and she was working with some big global finance companies, right? So they, she was tasked with one particular or one challenge wherein she had to figure out why the users, despite loving their product, were not signing up for free trials, right? And it turned out that they would come to the page wherein you would sign up for the free trial, and then it would ask you to enter the card, and then it would say, enter your card details. That's about it. And then when they asked a few people who had come until this point, and then they did not sign up for the free trial, the single thing that stood out there was that they were not sure if my card would be charged immediately or later on. So the UX writer's simple tweak over there was to add a sentence to say your card will not be charged for 14 days or 6 months or whatever was the trial period. That one single sentence of 5 words or something. I forget the exact number of words right now, but then those 5 words in one extra line to that UX, it changed the entire trajectory. I mean, this was a very famous trainer, and now this is a very common practice across everything, say Google Play apps or even Cred, maybe, I don't know. Anywhere you have to add your card for a free trial, it tells you that, we are not charging your entire thing, or this, whatever you've seen in the pricing page is not being charged that. It's only a very small thing or even nothing as of now. Even PayPal does this. They say when you're trying to make an international transaction, it says that, at least SBI sends to me. It says that we will be deducting 2 rupees for verification, which will be refunded to your account, and so on and so forth, right? So therefore, a few words. I mean, it's just the character limit of one SMS, but it helps you understand that you're not running into a problem. So therefore, again, a lot of digressions and tangential explanations there. But the point is that it is because of these problems that people are discovering. They are fine tuning the writing exercises also to solve very specific problems or very specific lines of problems. So, so yeah, when as things evolve, as new problems are discovered, new types of documentations also will be coming up. So it's 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 a bit crazy. I mean, you can't really box the kind of document that we are creating right now. Again, where do you draw the line between a video which is helpful in understanding the product versus a video that is purely for marketing, right? I mean, are both of them documentation, or is it because if the marketing team creates that video of explainer video, is it still considered documentation because the documentation team did not create it? So the lines are all a bit blurred and it's all a bit crazy right now. So I don't know if I have a direct answer to the question of what are the kind of documents these days, but yeah, what kind of solution that can be provided, it's as simple as that. Anything that is a problem, if you give us some time, just like the product manager or anybody else, we can also come up with interesting solutions that can help your business.
No, makes sense. So someone who's like starting out there as a documenter, right? They're not really sure about what type of documenter they should become, and they're just starting, or maybe they're still in college, or they are a fresh graduate, let's say. What would be some of your burning tips that you would give them for starting out, and what could be the common pitfalls that they might get into, and you would like them to avoid?
Yeah, that's a bit tricky, especially again, some years back or even now, there is a common joke where they say that to get a job you need to have experience, but to gain experience you need to have a job. It's largely the same thing in documentation these days. there are a lot of people who, like I said, because of various reasons which are happening in parallel, people are realizing, both the users, the people who run businesses, and the general public are realizing the benefit or the importance of documentation, and they want to get into that as career options or something. But then the problem is that we don't really have a proper unified course as such, or a certification as such, which will necessarily help, right? What I mean by that is, even if you have a certification, or even if you're an expert with 10, 15 years of writing experience, you're still asked mandatory to attend a writing test, even in the best of companies, right? So if I had to start off with documentation, what I would say is that there are open source projects. Yeah, you just have a look at them. You can contribute to them. If you contribute to them not because you want your documentation necessarily appearing on that page, but because you know how things work, how you actually which part of the puzzle you fit in the whole picture, right? So that's one. And also, Google, for all its pluses and minuses, they have a very good course called on technical writing, aimed at developers, right? If you are a developer, then it tells you how to go about even thinking about the documentation. So, so yeah, just put an effort in terms of understanding what documentation is. You don't even need to know the different forms of documentation. Like I said, the UX writer or the PRD documentation and all of that. That's not really necessary because it can always change. But if you understand that is the bare minimum. You need to know what a technical writer is, how it is different from a content writer, for example, and ideally your English should be decent enough, for the simple reason that, again, as I've said, technical documentation plays its own importance, has its own importance in the product lifecycle. So you can't really have a document where the user will spot grammatical errors, right? It's distracting. You're looking at, you're reading through a document trying to solve a problem, but then your eye or your subconscious mind catches something that shouldn't be there, or something that is there that was supposed to be there, but it isn't there. So yeah, some strength in your English is absolutely mandatory. But other than that, I would say one or two, even just one contribution to an open source project which was not even accepted, for example. You just have to attempt and show that this is what I had written. That, I would say, would definitely help opening a few doors. And if you're absolutely just starting off, ask for referrals. Referrals are gold when it comes to job hunting. Uh, if if you know somebody who can put you in touch with somebody who's a documentarian, or who can put you in touch with the documentation team in the company, I would say that will definitely open a few doors for you much faster.
Yeah. So, what are some of your suggestions for resources and books, not just on documentation, but someone who's starting out on their professional journey, or maybe is an aspiring entrepreneur? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of my favorite books has been Quiet Power by Susan Cain. Um a lot of my friends, including me, you can relate to the book because it's written by an introvert about introverts, and how they should not look at themselves in a lesser manner as compared to the extroverts, right? I mean, the for 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 all its minuses, we have been in a business universe, where extroverts and people who can speak, who can show off bountifuls of energy, have been rewarded. For whether it's right or wrong, that's been the case. But and therefore, conversely, what's happening is people who do not really take the first opportunity to speak up, who have to be asked three, four times before they can add any contribution to a meeting. They always feel like they're lesser, the second class citizens or something like that. So read that book because it helps you figure out what the strength is despite being an introvert, and how you can still add equally to those contributions, how you can balance out the over enthusiasm of the extroverts with your subtle reasoning, the possibility that exists wherein you can balance out the things. That's one book which is really helpful. I'm currently reading The Culture Map by Erin Mayer. That's in this age, I would say, is really helpful, especially after the pandemic, because the themes are really global. Even as freelancers, we talk to people on the other side of the world, for example, and there are such subtle differences in the culture which will remain unknown to both the parties that will eventually lead to miscommunication. For example, in India we have the habit of nodding, and we have different types of nods for everything, right? But uh, if you look at an American, they think that when you're nodding, if you're nodding like this, of course it's a yes, but we have a habit of saying this also. I mean, some Indians do. So the American, on the other hand, is going to think that you're not agreeing with him just because you're nodding your head, you're just moving your head, and then he's going to try even more to convince you of whatever he's speaking about. So it keeps creating that loop where it's not productive. He's going to be frustrated, and you're going to think, why is he treating me like a child? Why is he explaining the same thing over and over again? So it's not good for either of the two people. So understanding this will help, and therefore this culture map book, which I just picked up, that's also really helpful, especially if you're looking to join a company, say a startup which has operations in multiple countries, or even a huge MNC wherein you may regularly interact with colleagues from across borders or across time zones. That would be really helpful. In terms of specifically for writing, like I said, I don't really know that there's a good book or a must-read book, especially because things are changing so rapidly these days with the advent of AI and all of that. Um, I'm not really sure. I would rather stay abreast of innovations and technologies rather than hook myself to a specific book which teaches me how to write.
Yeah. Yeah, those were very good book suggestions. I would definitely try out the introvert one because, yeah, it kind of resonates with me as well. Um, like my last question is that because generative AI is taking over, right? You have also mentioned in one of your suggestions that despite generative AI taking over, how documenters can add in value, right? So for people who are like starting out, especially, how could they tackle this issue of, let's say, that there are a lot of startups who might say that, okay, AI is already doing this for us. So, why would we want someone on board? There are a lot of people, there are a lot of startups and companies which, who are doing this, right? I mean, this is happening if we, deny it or not. So, how do you think, we can handle it as individuals or like professionals who are starting out in their journey?
Yeah, again, when it comes to documentation, especially with not even technical marketing, even AI can even come up with white papers or proper formatted papers which you can submit to places like IEEE. So that side is it's going to be a defeating argument if you take that line. But I would still say that as a proper documentation person, if you are somebody who really needs to look at the thing, look at the software, see what problems you run into when you're logging in, uh, and all of that. AI, as of now, still cannot do that. It still cannot probe exactly. You can probably automate the testing side of things, but what happens with the testing results? Right now, it's just going back to the people who are developing the thing. It's not coming to the documentation side, right? So, long story short, what I would say to counter that argument would be that yes, AI can help you come up with words and ideas and bullet points, but there has to be some raw data for AI to work on, something for the AI to munch on, and who's providing the data, who's providing at least those bullet points or those uh, convoluted mismatch of ideas from which a technical documentation is created, and who will then verify if that is in line with it or not. How do you know that AI is prone to hallucination, especially when it comes to technical documentation, because the data set that it can work on is at least comparatively very small. So how do you know that it's accurate? How do you know that it is consistent with your company's style and tone and branding and all of that? How do you do that? So as long as AI will not automatically solve that, it's easy to counter these arguments as a technical writer. But yeah, I mean, at least for the next 2 years, I suppose we'd still be having a job. After that, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, like I got a lot of insights from this session, to be honest. Like I still have a lot of questions, but I think keeping, time constraint in mind, let us look at any of the audience, if they have any questions. Um, All of you, you can drop in your questions if you have any for Abhilash to answer here.
And also, again, just because silence is awkward, I would also uh, suggest people, if there are people who want to take up documentation as a career, I would suggest to try and observe things wherever they come across documentation or wherever they come across a lack of documentation. It doesn't necessarily have to be in software, in products, in apps or anything, even if it's outside. Say, for example, if you're, can be as simple as a lock on the door, right? I mean, uh, these days those keys are common where you can't really duplicate them. The ones with what they call as dimples or something on the keys. Apparently, they cannot be duplicated. I don't know if it's true or not, but let's assume it is true. So in that case, if I'm a user, if I lose my key, what happens? Or if I have to obtain a set of duplicate keys from that, what happens? There is a way. Apparently, you just write to the manufacturer with the code or serial number of the lock, and then they send you. But yeah, if you do not know that solution, what happens? Where do you go? How do you reach out to somebody? How do you figure out if that documentation exists and all of that? I mean, right now with the advent of Amazon and all, it's easy. We just call up customer care. We ask, this is what is happening. But let's assume that option was not there. What would you do? How would you figure out where the documentation is? And if the documentation is not there, how would you actually come up with that documentation? You don't really have to, I mean, if you can, if you want to go and create some documentation, nothing like it. But even otherwise, as a mental exercise, thinking about even the simplest of things, how would I document this would uh, would really help, if you're looking for a job as a documentarian.
Yeah, makes sense. I don't see any questions from the audience. So yeah, like it was a great session. We gained a lot of insights. And do everyone do watch out for the newsletter edition as well. We will be releasing that soon. And thanks a lot, Vilash, for coming on board to this call and sharing all your insights and all your knowledge with us. So yeah, thanks a
Yeah.
lot.
Thank you for having me. It's been, I mean, I just did not realize that it's already been 8 o'clock. Time just flew away in this conversation. So, again, thanks for the chance and thanks for being such a great host.
Thanks a lot, and have a great day ahead. Yeah,
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Bye.
yeah. Bye.